It's Friday night or Friday day. I don't know. Happy time zone, everybody. Welcome to Althing Considered, your weekly dose of heathen news, events, and culture from the Troth. My name is Lauren Crow. I am the president and CEO of the Troth. With me is my favorite communications director,
your only communications director. Hi, my name's Ben Kowalski-Greg. I'm the communications director for the Troth. We are really happy here to have wonderful transition. Our guests for tonight, which is Kevin and Áine from the Murder Sheet podcast. Hello, Kevin. Hello, Áine.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
And I'm so excited. For those of you who didn't hear, Joe Hunding, who is our director of our InReach, our prison services, and we were on the Murder Sheet a couple of months ago. Wonderful experience. I had so much fun with them. And so now we have them back with us to talk about the Delphi murders and why this matters to heathens. Because I'll give you a hint. It's satanic panic, take out Satan, insert Odin. There's your TLDR. But there's a lot more to it. We're going to talk about how people who are Ásatru and heathen are getting lumped into Odinism, and talk about this horrific crime, which really what it boils down to is the murder of two young girls who are out hiking, and now this crime has been blown up into... I don't know about you guys. I'm a true crime person. My grandmother had so many true crime novels in her house. And so in the summers I would read them because what else am I supposed to do? And this is probably one of the most hot mess cases I've ever seen.
I think that's fair to say at this point. We're in the Indiana Supreme Court. So, I think once it reaches that level, you can definitely say there's a messiness about it.
Yeah, definitely. It's just one bizarre twist and turn after another.
Yeah.
And we, in fact, I was watching the Supreme Court hearing, was it Thursday when they were before the Supreme Court? And I'm just, I cannot believe this is happening. This is an actual case here.
And there's something like that every week.
Yeah, it's every week. And these, I want to say, I also want to give credit to all our members who have been who've been helping. Kevin and Áine were the two people who actually were able to help us get on court TV and speak about our faith openly, and not have it going through a third person. So I give them a lot of credit and a lot of thanks for helping us do that, because otherwise it was a whole lot of people who had never met a heathen speaking about our faith and had no idea what they were talking about. And sometimes they still don't. But if I hear Odinite one more time. But I will say it's still been a great experience. And I've made some good connections with other people who I feel like have really been wanting to learn and been supportive. So it's been good. So if you guys can just give us like I'm going to date myself if I say this, the Reader's Digest condensed version of the Delphi case.
Absolutely. So February 13th, 2017, it's a pretty mild day in Delphi, Indiana, which is a small city, the county seat of Carroll County. That's up north of us, at least, in Indiana. It's a pretty rural area, lots of farming. But this is a little city, and the kids there have school off that day because they didn't use their snow days, and so they got extra days off. So Abby Williams and Libby German are two very good friends. They're in middle school. Abby's 13, Libby's 14. They go to the Monon High Bridge, which is this kind of creepy old bridge that's really high up in the sky, old railroad bridge from Indiana's golden age of rail. And it's now used as a trail. And so they go on that bridge, they disappear. And unfortunately, the next day they were found by searchers. They had been murdered. Turns out Libby had captured a man accosting them on her phone. This captured international attention. We've heard from people from Sweden, from the Netherlands, from Australia. It's really, and I think what speaks to people is, the horrible circumstances, the mystery around it, and also the fact that she caught the killer most likely on camera. And people think if we can just make a face out of those pixels, we can figure it out. So there's like a kind of a communal thing there. People get really into it as a result of that. And what happened recently, after 5 years of speculation. Maybe this guy, maybe this guy. There was an arrest. Richard Allen is arrested. He's a local CVS manager, doesn't have a criminal history. From what we can tell from talking to people who knew him, quiet guy, kept to himself, but nothing, no bad vibes that we've heard about at least. And so he gets attorneys, he gets assigned public defenders who, had pretty good reputations coming into this, going, back into different criminal cases that they've had. And they ended up putting out a theory that involves Odinism. And sort of that's where we stand today as a little TLDR.
And then there was a whole thing with and when I say this is a bonkers case, a lot of the bonkersness has to do with the attorneys. Evidence was stolen from their offices. You guys actually helped solve the case of who leaked the evidence from that, which I will admit I got really excited. I was a fan of their podcast before I went on, and so hearing that episode, I was like, yeah, they were going to figure that out. I figured that, but someone who was affiliated with someone and used to work for the law office actually leaked a lot of confidential documents and discovery to Facebook. It's just Facebook, wasn't it?
Like a guy he met on Reddit and Facebook who was also interested in Delphi, or a guy he knew in real life who was also interested in Delphi, who then sent it to another guy that he knew.
And this material actually included very graphic crime scene images. And obviously these never should have been seen by anyone outside of the attorneys and eventually a jury.
Yeah.
And so that's led to its own complications, as the trial judge in the case said. Basically, the fact that you allowed this to happen is gross negligence on your part. And she put a lot of pressure on them to leave the case. They left the case and then said, well, it shouldn't count because we were coerced to do it. And that got into a big back and forth that was only resolved yesterday at the Indiana Supreme Court.
Yes.
And now they're back.
They're back. But one thing that's a bit unexpected right now is that we thought that one could not remain, we didn't think they could both remain, but what the Indiana Supreme Court ruled was that the judge will also remain. So it's status quo back again, but everything's changed, obviously.
So let's dive a bit into this Frank's memorandum, because this is the part that I think is the most important. And I want to back up just a little bit. So let's talk a bit about how Mr. Allen was essentially not put in the county jail. He was put into a prison in protective custody. I don't know about you guys. Now, I have done in-reach work, prison work. I have a friend who is a prison chaplain. My uncle was a state trooper. I have never heard of this before. Is this highly unusual in Indiana as well? I mean, this is something I've never heard of. Sort of like someone who is arrested and has already been in prison and they're putting them back there because they violated parole or, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Typically when a person is arrested and is awaiting trial, if they're kept in custody, they're kept in a county jail. And the county jails, they're called like pre-conviction detainees.
Yes.
And the county jails are actually set up to house people who have that status, which, for instance, means they have facilities which allow these people to easily confer with their lawyers and stuff. And that is what happens in the vast majority of the cases.
Yeah, I'm aware of one case here in Indiana that we're following that involved a not identical situation, but does have a pre-trial detainee in a prison in Miami Correctional. And that's John Wayne Lehman. He's accused of a cold case murder that recently had a hit with DNA, murdering a 17-year-old girl back in 1975. But in that situation, basically the Noble County Jail commander, or the sheriff rather, was basically like, he has so many medical issues. We can't deal with this. This is not safe. All this equipment needs to be in here with him. It's not safe for our other inmates or our staff. And there was a whole fight. Indiana Department of Correction did not want him, but eventually after some threats of contempt of court filings were thrown around by the judge, they took him. So he's in prison now.
Yeah, the only example I can think of is a prisoner who was in a county jail and they sent him to essentially the geriatric unit at one of our prisons here, because it was a similar situation. The guy was in his 80s and very ill. Same situation. So why then did Richard Allen get sent to this prison that was a significant, and this thing was Indiana, for those of our international viewers that, and everyone who's watching the replay, by the way, thank you. If you're not watching this live and you're watching the replay, for those of you who are international, because we're an international organization, Indiana is a rectangular state, for lack of a better way to describe it. Delphi, if my understanding, is towards the south, and this prison is towards the north. Well, it's towards the south in comparison to the prison, which is way up very, very far north.
Yes. Delphi is central northish, maybe the north of central or the south of north. I always think of them as north because we're to the south of them in Indianapolis area, but you're basically that's right. It's very far away. And Westville, as you said, it's right at the top. So it's far away. It's kind of inconvenient. It's also, more importantly, inconvenient once they get in there for the lawyers to access him, because it's not set up that way.
And so essentially what happened is this crime occurs in Carroll County, Indiana, and the sheriff of Carroll County, who runs the jail, who technically is his obligation and his duty to house this particular inmate, he indicates, we're a small jail, we don't have a lot of staff. This is a crime that has attracted international attention. Tensions are really, really high. We're not sure we can protect him. And so a judge agreed to that. And so because of that, they transferred him into state custody. And the prison they transferred him to is, as you mentioned, Westville. It's a considerable distance away. And that becomes very relevant for what we're going to be talking about later because of some of the guards there.
And I'll say I'm uncomfortable with this decision on the part of the authorities here, because I think it would be better for him to be closer to his attorneys and be able to access them easier. So I feel like a jail is more appropriate. But I should note that in fairness to Carroll County, this is a county where the sheriff himself has to do prisoner transports. It's very small. They don't have a lot of manpower. We were reading a Carroll County Comet newspaper. Unfortunately, that went defunct this year, but they had a picture of the sheriff out there managing a road work crew of jail inmates who were doing community service work. And so it's not like he can really delegate. So I think the concerns about staffing and whether they could protect him were reasonable given how high profile this is.
Is it also the case that in cases where the crime is, or the case itself is very inflammatory to the public or to the immediate area, that the prisoner people who are awaiting trial are put in situations like they're transferred to a different jail or facility or prison? Does this happen often, or is this extremely rare, or just in cases where the subject is really inflammatory?
It's a great question. I'm not aware of another case where this has happened. It could happen between jails. Also, sometimes with jails, there might be overcrowding or issues like that. I would say though that, in general, it is very high profile. But what the lawyers would end up arguing is that, if fear over his safety was a concern, he should have been the one to ask for that. That shouldn't have been preemptively done, especially since he didn't get any direct threats from anybody. It was just a perception of possible. And, you do hear from prisoners that when people are accused of hurting children, that is the lowest of the low. You're going to be a target after. So I think this may be a situation where maybe both sides are coming from an understandable place, at least at this point.
Okay.
Hey, I'm from a county with less than 10,000 people where I grew up. Town of less than 1,000. I know when we had a pretty inflammatory murder in the 90s, they moved him to the next county over. And that seems reasonable because that's, 20 miles, right? That's not, and most lawyers don't even practice in that county. They're coming from the next county over. So it seems to me that would be a more reasonable thing. Or even you would think Indianapolis would be far, let's talk to the Indianapolis, whatever. I don't know what county that's in. I apologize. Yeah. Let's talk to Indianapolis, see maybe if we can send him to that jail. I agree that decision doesn't make sense. However, that decision is what led to this Frank's memorandum, because there are two guards who, based on what I have read, what I understand, and I'll be honest with you, and what we said on your podcast, Joe and I were dead wrong. And we were shocked at how wrong we were about the patches. But they were wearing Valknot patches, which are interlocking triangles, and it's a symbol that is found in Scandinavia in rune stones and other things that is believed to be associated with Odin. But we don't have like concrete, like most things in heathenry, we don't really have a concrete understanding of it.
Honestly, I don't even know what the proper orientation of it is. In some pictures, it's pointing down at the ground. Sometimes it's pointing at somebody, but there's no one particular It's a very weird symbol, and and if anyone tells you they know exactly what it means, they're feeding you something. So yeah, that was something I observed just doing the research before we came on. I was like, wait a minute, that thing kind of appears in a lot of different ways.
If it's sideways, that means you need to play the video.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I saw a ton of videos have it on there. Yeah, it goes away when you click.
It's all connected.
But it's only one triangle, right? Angles within angles, wheels within wheels. Yeah.
And then a patch that says, "In Odin we trust." And I laughed because I can probably name 15 people that have that patch that are veterans or cops, not necessarily on their uniform, but they've got them on gear bags, on their car. I mean, I hate to call it a cliche, but it kind of is in our community. So these guards that we speculated, and I think Joe was kind of on the right track, were likely guards that were assigned to observe him, or were his transport guards, were guards that worked likely in the, I don't know if they call it protective custody or a SHU, or I'm not sure what they call it in Indiana. Here it's going to be the special housing unit. But they were likely guards assigned to that. And they were wearing these things. And so that somehow led into this conspiracy. And they also found out that these men that we are not, I'm just going to say for the record, we are not going to name the names of these men that were named in the Frank Memorandum. As far as anyone knows, they are innocent. They may be a little disagreeable to some of our tastes because they are involved with the gang, the Vinlanders, which is a non-religious gang. However, I don't believe that we need to bring their names into this. So we are just going to call them dude 1, dude 2, whatever. Like, I'm not going to get into that because they don't deserve this. And the guards especially don't deserve this.
Can I pause for a second and just run back?
Yeah.
What's a memorandum? Just for those at home who don't know what's a memorandum in this case? Why do we know what's in it? How did this get out? So could you guys explain to us what a memorandum is in a trial? Like, what does it mean? How are they used?
I'll explain just the setup, and then I'll let Kevin explain exactly what a memorandum is. But one thing that's interesting about this is Frank's motion ultimately, fundamentally deals with, did the police lie or omit to a point where we need to kind of hit pause on this whole thing and maybe consider suppressing.
So
evidence.
In this particular memorandum, the key evidence in this case, the single biggest piece of evidence that ties this man to the crime scene, is a bullet. They found a bullet at the crime scene, which they say they can link to a gun they found in his house. And so obviously they want to do what they can to get that gun evidence thrown out. And so they filed what's called a Frank's motion, in which they claim that the police told lies or hid things when they asked for that search warrant, which led to the gun. And so then a memorandum is a document you file to go into detail and explain this is why this motion needs to be granted. And so in the course of this memorandum to support their motion to get the gun evidence thrown out, they did decide to go into a great deal of detail about their particular theory of the case, which involves accusing, as we've mentioned, a few gentlemen who are involved with Odinism.
And some of whom may
No,
not.
and they're not. Stop. Let's pause for a minute.
Yeah.
They're not Odinists. They're
They're-
Ásatru, which are two separate things. And that I got mad about that on Court TV the other night.
Oh,
They
yeah.
are
They did-
separate.
They
the
call
guards
them
did not.
Odinists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And then
the
in
guards
terms
did
of-
not identify themselves as Odinists. They did not.
Yeah.
The guards identify as heathen. The men that they're accusing as actually being the murderers, who are residents of around Delphi. I don't want to be more specific than that because some of them aren't actually from Delphi, but we'll say the greater Delphi metropolitan region. Sarcastically a little.
So in terms of the guards,
Yeah.
another piece of evidence against this man is while he was incarcerated at Westville, in a couple of phone calls with his wife and his mother, he confessed to the crime. He indicated that he was responsible for it. And so in this Frank's memorandum, they indicate that, well, isn't it possible that perhaps these guards intimidated him and would say things like, "We will hurt your family if you don't confess." And then they go on to say in a footnote, well, he never told us that this happened. It's just speculation.
We don't have any evidence for that.
Yeah.
But what if it happened?
So basically,
Now,
with a very broad brush that everybody's involved with.
I just want to give I just want to kind of pause for a second and give some identifying factors for our listeners. The men who have allegedly committed the crime, the 5 men, because there are 5 of them, identify themselves as Ásatru. They do not identify as Odinist. They identify as Ásatru. The guards identify as heathen, and to the best of my understanding, doing a little online stalking, I'm not going to lie, seem to be inclusive heathens. So that is, which is like the polar opposite as far as you can go from an Odinist.
Yeah.
So I just want to toss that out there to people so that it's clear for at least the heathen listeners that you guys understand. So far, I've yet to see any evidence that anyone named in this case is actually an Odinist.
And I'll actually say this.
Yeah.
One of the fellows who is named as an Odinist, I don't believe actually, he may not even be Ásatru. He might, he might actually be a Christian or something else. Like, it's not, there's no evidence on his social media on one of these guys that A, he knows some of these other people, and B, that he actually practices the same faith of any sort. So it really is very murky, but they are in the document labeling them all as Odinists specifically.
Now, let's be specific. They're naming them as Odinites.
Yeah.
Yes, they're rocks. It's a secret rock society.
What I also want to follow it up with is just grounding this. Why do I know about this now? I mean, these kinds of memoranda don't typically make it out of the courtroom, right? They typically are given to the judge. As far as I understand it, they're given to the judge. The judge then rules on that motion and says, "Yeah, go ahead," or knock yourself out, or "No, I'm not gonna permit that." And then the trial just moves on from there. Why is it very typical that stuff like this gets out? How does stuff like this get out? And also, has the judge ruled on this motion? I'm still curious. So I guess in reverse order, has the judge ruled on this yet? And how did this get out to us?
The judge has not yet ruled. This was filed in September, and the attorneys who filed it were off the case from mid-October until yesterday. And she indicated that it was taking her a lot of time to rule on it because the memorandum itself is relatively brief, about 130 some pages.
That's brief.
But there is thousands
in the law world, right?
Yeah, in the law world.
Thousands of pages of supporting documents and hundreds of hours of interviews, recordings that back it up. The judge actually indicated that she wasn't happy that this became public. And what occurred in the case was the defense attorneys filed this into the court system, I believe, in the overnight hours.
Yeah, I believe so.
Like maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. And so it was on the public system for a while. A lot of people follow the case, including reporters, and when it was on the public system, they grab it. By public system, Indiana has a page or a database called My Case where you can log on, and anything that's filed into a case that if access is granted to the public, you can find it there.
And I will say this about this situation, it was a bit controversial beyond the Odinist angle, because it goes into extreme disturbing detail about the murder of these two girls, the actual deaths. And I know a lot of people felt that may have been unnecessary detail to include in a Frank's memorandum. So that was a bit controversial, with some people criticizing that as well.
And it's so the My Case is, I guess, similar to like Pacer or okay.
Yeah. It's like
So-
Pacer for what
For
state?
Indiana, the Hoosier Pacer.
Yeah. So I do want to bring up the police investigation part of this. And that is, in the 5 years essentially between the murder and the arrest of Richard Allen, the police did investigate a Odinist angle and then dismissed it. They even consulted with a professor at one of the colleges in Indiana, though I will be honest with you, I'm a snob too, so let's put that out there. I don't know that this professor would be the best person to consult. I can name you about 6 other people, one of them that's been on our show, who would have been better, sociologists to consult. People like Jefferson Calico, Jennifer Snook. I mean, there are actual sociologists that deal with modern groups as opposed to someone whose expertise is in early medieval Scandinavian literature.
That makes sense. That's a pretty niche subject and may not be super relevant to the modern Odinist, Ásatru person or a Heathen, because it's so old. I was struck by that too, actually, because I majored in history, and there's certain things that academia is so niche. You specialize so much, and you might be able to speak about a subject better than most people, but maybe if it's not quite your wheelhouse, it makes more sense to consult others.
But yeah, the investigators took a look at that angle. They took a look at a lot of angles. And it's like when you watch a mystery movie or read a mystery novel, there's often evidence that suggests, it may have been person X or may have been person Y. But they just were never able to develop enough of a probable cause to file charges for anyone connected with that particular theory. And there were other theories they looked at as well.
Yeah, and we will say, I think it's important for your listeners or your viewers to understand that there was a 3-person sort of investigative team, mostly tasked with the so-called Odinist lead. They developed that. That's a lot of what's in the memorandum comes from the work that these 3 gentlemen did. And I think it's important to note that their version of the theory seems to be a different one. Maybe some of the differences are major, maybe some are subtle, but it is different. And I think it's important to note the differences, because I think it tells us something about where the defense may be coming from with why they changed some things, why they maybe went in a different direction in certain ways, and why they maybe expanded out the theory. Because I can tell you, in the original iteration of the theory, of course, there's no mention of prison guards, because that didn't happen yet. But also, that's one element of the theory that kind of, I think, people have trouble with. Like, that's expanding something from like a local thing or even a statewide thing to like a statewide thing with like multiple axes in the prisons. That is like very complicated. And whenever you have to make a conspiracy that big in order to explain away things, it starts to become more vulnerable, I think, to nitpicking, or even maybe factual questions about, does that make any sense?
So when you guys, this was not your first encounter with the Odinist theory. You guys had seen this early on, or was when you saw this memorandum come out, were you like, whoa, where did this come from? What is this theory? So it didn't necessarily come out of left field for you guys. You guys were kind of aware that there was this early angle going into it, or was this completely surprising?
We were kind of aware of it. There was a number of early leads that were followed that went nowhere, basically. And we were aware of those. We were surprised to the extent that everyone that we had mentioned it to indicated that there was nothing there. This wasn't serious. So it was surprising to see it resurrected. But we were aware that it existed.
And in such lurid detail as well.
Yes. And also in such giving away all your cards, essentially, because I mean, ultimately, there has to be hearings to determine what you can present in court. You can't just get out there and say whatever you want. But the defense does have a lot of leeway to present a strong defense. So I almost felt like something like this might have worked better as like a shock and awe thing in front of the jury. Like, look at what and like, whoa, okay, maybe there is something there. But putting it out there, as we've seen, people have picked it apart so much, and it just seems like I don't know strategically if that makes sense.
I will say though, in my experience, even in online groups, even in I'll be honest, even in your own Facebook group, the amount of people who want to believe in the Odinist theory is alarming. Or the people who want to think that every person now that worships the Norse gods is a racist, it's really been alarming, and I am concerned. But I think that most of our people who are probably watching this have experienced it. So what is if we can take the 100 and so pages of the Franks Memorandum and break it down to the essential theory of the Franks motion, what is their theory on why he confessed and who actually committed this crime? And absolutely. You guys can, go as long or short as you want, but I kind of just want to give people the idea of how they're working this in with the Odinism specifically and the guards and everything else.
Absolutely. So the high level version of what is presented in the Franks Memorandum, which is the defense's current theory of the case, is that essentially the girls were murdered as part of a Odinist ritual in the forest of Delphi, that they went there, basically at the behest of someone they had a personal connection to. One of them had a personal connection to, and their father, this person's father, then was involved in this, what they call an Odinist cult, and that they sacrificed them essentially. And so, okay, that's a lot. In addition to that, one facet of the theory is that it combines men from the Delphi area, let's say, with men from an area to the south of Indianapolis. So that's in Rush County. And so it's kind of bringing those two groups together. There is some evidence that there is mutual friends or mutual acquaintances between them, but we can get more into that later. But it's basically saying all these men coalesced on Delphi that day, sacrificed the girls, and subsequently, kind of were able to hide.
Well, let me mention one thing. There were sticks found on the bodies of the girls, and they alleged in the Franks Memorandum that the sticks were not left there randomly, that they were actually left there in a way to, I always mispronounce this word.
Runes. They were left in the shape of runes. I was saying ruins before. Everyone wanted to kill me for saying it like that, and I apologize. But it's runes, and they basically say that there's runes in the form of sticks on the bodies, and that there's also a rune on a tree. Unfortunately, and this this photo did get out there, but in the blood of one of the victims. And it's just very disturbing. So they're saying the crime scene supports some sort of heathen context to some of this, and they're alleging Odinism as a result. To get to the prison aspect, so he's arrested, he's put in Westville, and he confesses in several instances. We don't really know the context. We don't know exactly what he said, but it was recorded on the phone to his wife and mother. So not really your typical false confession thing where it's an authority figure or a jailhouse snitch or something like that. It's like two trusted family members. Shortly after this is when the defense starts kind of releasing what could be said to be more controversial or more kind of attention grabbing filings, kind of after this confession is made. It sort of seems to have, led to the safekeeping, them contesting the safekeeping order, and also them, potentially the Franks Memorandum down the line. So what the Franks, initially in the safekeeping order, they basically alluded to mental health problems. They threw around words like schizophrenic, psychotic when talking about his confessions. This is a man who's lost his mind, essentially. Later on, they completely backtrack from that. And then it becomes, actually, it was a rational act. He was doing it to protect his family from these Odinist guards. So it's interesting to see the switch from like mental health to he was forced to do it. And I think there's something interesting in there that maybe we can unpack later.
And it would be very unusual for someone to develop schizophrenia, especially at that age.
Oh, yeah. That rarely, very rarely. I mean, we talked to mental health professionals about this, and they were like, you can become psychotic for a number of reasons. That's a symptom. That's a symptom of different issues. But, schizophrenia typically is in your early 20s. Much younger people typically get that.
Yeah. And so the theory is the guards forced him to do it, and there's an Odinist gang and group and active Odinists at that prison.
Yes.
So funny story, we actually have contacts at that prison. We actually have had prisoners contact us. That's actually one of the prisons we work with. So yeah, there have been contacts by people who are heathen in that prison. So the thing is, if heathenry and Odinism and Ásatru, it's paganism in general is one of the fastest growing religions currently. So it would make, right now we have contacts with over 100 prisons in the US right now in jails. So the odds are in any prison you go to, you're going to encounter some sort of paganism, whether it be Wicca or Hellenism or Kemeticism or heathenry or even Odinism. That is, by the factor that it is such a fast growing religious movement, that's not surprising. However, and to have people who work in prisons that are heathen, like I said, Jo, who you interviewed on your show, worked in the prisons for her entire career doing mental health stuff, and she was heathen. The idea though of, to me, and knowing people who've worked in prisons, the idea that someone could be an Odinist and then pass all the background checks and everything you have to do to become a prison guard, and then to become a prison guard in the special housing, the additional scrutiny, and to be an officer, those are a lot of moving pieces to put together into this kind of conspiracy.
We interviewed one gentleman who was a former inmate of that prison and had insights on just the prison system in Indiana, and he noted that like in his experience, you might have corruption among CEOs, maybe one who's down with the Aryan Brotherhood and he's helping them get money or get drugs out of, you can absolutely have this. So he outlined like there are instances where there absolutely are those connections with gangs or some situation. Often it's like a monetary thing, not like an ideological thing necessarily. But he also noted that like he'd never heard of like a guard being part of like a cult sort of thing. So it's kind of like, it's just interesting. And I think what I find interesting, but maybe somewhat disturbing, and maybe some of your viewers agree with this, being heathen. I mean, as a non-heathen, just looking at it, I think everyone can acknowledge that people of all faiths can do awful things. And to say that a crime scene might be religiously influenced is a valid thing. And that should be looked at. Absolutely. Where the Franks Memorandum kind of, I worry about this and the effect it has on innocent people is where you have symbols that are associated with heathenry being conflated with A, Odinism, but B, just kind of cast in a very sinister light in general. Like, if there's a Catholic cult, I'm Catholic. If there's a Catholic cult and they're, putting, symbols of a crucifix out there and that's associated with a crime scene, I don't really feel like it's fair to judge Catholics who might be in the same state working at an institution miles away for having a crucifix necklace. I mean, we can debate about what's appropriate to wear to a workplace, and I think that's fair, but I guess it's just when you have it being like, you can almost hear the ominous horror movie music playing in the background, reading the document where it's like, and he had these triangles, it's like, I think that's where maybe some more precise language could have benefited, and also learning more about Odinism versus Ásatru versus heathenry would have been helpful.
And it reminds me so much of, I grew up in East Arkansas, between Memphis, West Memphis, and Jonesboro. And if you know anything about the West Memphis Three, I grew up between where the crime happened and where the trial took place. And what a lot of people don't know is in the time right before the trial took place, a guy named Terry Riley tried to open a New Age store in Jonesboro, which is a college town, and was summarily run out of town. And I think that had a tremendous effect on the West Memphis 3 trial. And I know that like Maura Leverett, who's written books, agrees with me on that. And there's actually a really great documentary here on YouTube called March on Fort God about Terry Riley. But to me, I feel like that coloring can really dampen everyone, and it can really cause a lot of harm to to a heathen that lives in Texas or any other state who someone sees this and they're a true crime person and their only understanding of this is through this lens. They're going to think that, oh my God, are they going to take my kid and murder them in an Odinist cult murder?
Yeah, I wanted to ask this question of the greater cultural impact that you guys are seeing, because, those of you who grew up during the Satanic Panic, I know Lauren famously has war wounds from the Satanic Panic. But the Satanic Panic was, I believe there was some kind of inciting incident where it was like interviews with children about abuse. Do you guys recall?
Martin.
It was a show.
That was the McMartin preschool. Yeah, it was the McMartin preschool.
Yeah, this inciting incident, and it got caught up in like this general zeitgeist of value. These times they are a changing, and they're coming for your kids, right? I don't quite feel that zeitgeist at the moment directed towards heathens. It seems to be directed firmly at like trans people at the moment. But I think when Lauren talks about it, and when I've listened to your guys' show, it seems like small town America has really tuned into this case in particular. So me being a city boy, I don't really get a lot of this case, but like people I talk to from small towns, like everyone seems to be from Delphi. So how is this case and how is this argument or is this memo affected? How do you feel like it's affected the culture in like small town America, let's say? Like, do you guys feel like it's had an impact? Have you seen this impact? Where do you guys stand on that, or what have you seen?
It's a great question. I feel like it's probably too soon to tell about the impact in real world communities. I can tell you we see more quickly the internet community that's grown up around the case, and that could be people from anywhere, right? But I think one reason why this resonates with at least the internet community, but also may have an impact on the small towns, is that it really encourages do-it-yourself sleuthing. And that has been a facet of the case from the beginning. People really get into this. They're trying to put their suspect and put side by sides with the images from the bridge. Like there's been a lot of stuff that, if you do journalism, if you do any sort of investigative work or have a law enforcement or legal background, is pretty highly irresponsible. But people, I think, well-meaning people get caught up in it and kind of get emotionally invested, and then they kind of do this stuff like they might be able to solve it. And so what this theory does is that it takes, it gives a really good, from the defense's perspective, contrast to the theory that a guy who didn't really break the law as far as anyone knew got out of bed and then did something horrible and then went back to his life. Not like a Dennis Raid or a BTK. Like he went back to his life and seemingly didn't do anything else. Versus, oh my gosh, cult in the woods, all these people. And I think people tend to, I think psychologically, it's much more comforting to believe on some level in a larger conspiracy, because it's like, now it makes sense and it becomes an epic tale of like all of these people doing this awful thing versus one person, which is almost scarier. And so I think we've seen skepticism towards it. I think we've also seen people seem to, as Lauren said, want to believe it, because I think people feel like, how could one person just do something so horrible, have such a negative impact on so many people's lives, and get away with it for so long? Why wouldn't it be a group, especially as something as ominous sounding as a cult? Because you kind of get into the otherization of heathens here, but it's like, but labeling it a cult on top of Odinist. It
Yes.
just kind of gives the image of like people who are committed to a scary
Yeah.
cause and secrecy and shunning anyone else. So like maybe that's the kind of group that could do something so bad and get away with it. So I mean, it hits a lot of points that I think some people resonate with some people for a number of reasons.
Meanwhile, if they just spend 5 minutes in a room with a group of heathens or Odinists or whatever, they would discover we can't agree on anything. And yeah,
You
they
can't keep
figure out real
secrets
quick.
either. No.
Yeah, it's real hard to have a cult in this community. So one of the things I want to do,
You said, Lord, you sound almost disappointed.
Lauren's like, why can't I be the cult leader?
no, it's not that. It's Lauren tries to organize things in the organization. Yes. It's cat herding. It really is. It is cat herding. In fact, we have a board meeting tomorrow, and it's going to be cat herding. So one of the things I want to do is actually have, and I'm not sure who prepared this, and I apologize, but someone prepared a really great. They broke down the Facebook post. A lot of the Frank's memorandum is strongly based on Facebook.
That's a big section.
And so I have some of these because a lot of their inferences are based on runes, because some of them are not. A lot of them are based on like things that as a heathen, I look at this and nothing sparks. But from an outsider perspective, apparently this is scary and dangerous, even though one of the things I laughed at is like, oh my God, it's my first heathen painting. Like to me, this like literally looks so common, and to other people it looks scary. So I do kind of want to review this to other heathens, also just because I guess I kind of want them to see like what other people are talking about and like how they're viewing essentially heathenism in this kind of space. So, and I did actually block out names, except for the names of the victims, because we obviously know those. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And the reason I did that was just because I really wanted a chance to, oh goodness. Sorry. I forget this thing makes me, I'm on a different computer. And so.
Oh yeah, I feel it. So he's like, what is this spaceship? Is this the document that we talked about in our episode on the social media side of things, what that Thomas did, or is this something different?
This is the, hang on, I apologize. It is being a pain. Hang on, I'm trying to present this thing. It is not wanting to let me.
Well, do you mind if I ask a question while we wait?
Yeah, go ahead while I'm trying to fix this out.
Okay, cool. I did have another question for you guys, and this has to do with somewhat with the community response. One response that I've seen in when I've come up with, hey, I don't think a heathen did this, right? If I put that forward, the argument that might come back is, well, that's just no true Scotsman. Anybody can do evil things, right? How often do you guys see in the communities you run in like this Odinist theory? Do you see it getting traction in those communities simply because and when it does, is it because people are tying it to some, like, I'm gonna put it this way, put this question: what is it that people are tying specifically within, not just the symbols, but are there other things or themes or things that they hit on in Odinism? Because I've heard things about like magic spells, the number 9, the different like positions or things like that. Like, what is it specifically that people reference in these like, let's say like sleuther communities when they say like, yes, this, I know this about Odinism and that's why this connects. Do you guys have any of the general idea?
Yeah, so I'd say just macro speaking, and of course everything's different, and everything is subject to change in Delphi. Like any community online, there's trends, right? And so what we see is when it first was released, there was a very broad interest in it. I think there's been more skepticism toward it recently. The pendulum tends to swing. And so it may go back to people accepting it more, it may go back again to people being more skeptical. I think we're on a more skeptical side of the pendulum right now. In terms of what people like with a theory like Odinism, which of course is based on heathenry of faith, there's so much symbology associated with every faith. So when you have symbology and history and sort of the ability to research that yourself online, it becomes, I think, very easy to kind of add your own contribution in your own mind to this, you know, where you can say, well, you know, the hangman is associated with Odin because he's hanging for free, and that's the, you know, position. And so it just...
And when you're not familiar with the faith, a lot of parts of that faith can seem intimidating or even frightening to an outsider. Áine, she mentioned, is a Catholic, and some of the icons and imagery of Catholicism, when I was introduced to that, were a little surprising.
Yes, my raised Baptist husband was very much like, why is that man holding his skin?
yeah. Well, I was thinking, like, you just bringing up some of the Catholic iconography, when sometimes you see some of the depictions of the crucifixion, they can be quite brutal. So I could imagine someone coming from outside and going, "Oh my gosh, you all gather on Sunday and look at this," and you. I
may be referencing the wrong book, but I'm thinking The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. I think that's a book that deals heavily with Catholicism and whatnot. He is a part where one of the characters goes into a Catholic church and is like, "This is so tacky and awful," and he's kind of grappling with like the body and like the kind of the depiction and the violence almost of the Passion. And it's like, but you can, like, in reading that, you're like, oh yeah, like, you know, kind of like a self-dunk, you know, because he was Catholic, but you can see that from an outsider's perspective. If an alien came down, they'd be like, this guy's nailed to a cross. What are you doing?
Yeah. And that's just everyday stuff. Yeah. And that's the everyday stuff that you can find in most churches. You were talking before about some of the saints' iconography is rather brutal. And then if you get into the relics, it gets even more gruesome, because like there's a guy's tongue on display somewhere in Italy.
My ancestor is literally a relic. So he was killed by the British in Ireland, right? And so his head, you can go to the Cathedral at Drogheda in Ireland and see his head. It's Oliver Plunkett. It's horrifying. Don't look it up. But his head is literally there. So, you know, that's pretty macabre, but that is Catholicism. And like, I would be annoyed and resentful if somebody was taking, you know, maybe some people who were Catholics who did some bad things, or maybe people who are part of like a Catholic cult who may have done some bad things, and then conflating every symbol of my religion with said bad thing. I think there's a way to narrowly tailor a discussion where religion may be, you know, I'm not saying you can't say, oh, maybe some Odinists did it. I just think it's really difficult to like do the work, do the research, so that then you're not labeling all heathens with a broad brush, which is something I understand a lot of heathens feel after reading this document.
I have a question on that. Why didn't, like, to me, and I realize this is maybe a dumb question, I found that there was a stronger connection between to me there was such a strong connection between okay, finally, I'm sorry guys. To me there was much stronger connection when you discuss the discussion of like the gang part versus like, because they're all Vinlanders, right? And so to me it seemed a little weird that like, oh, I guess we're just not gonna there we go. Sorry. It did not want to share my actual like slide sharing. I don't know why. All right, let me zoom this in just a minute and give it a little bit.
I think you make a really good point, and I'll note that the Vinlander mention is an artifact from the fact this was developed by 3 investigators, 2 of whom were on the FBI Joint Counterterrorism Task Force. So those men had expertise with groups like the Vinlanders. So it makes sense that original group of investigators cultivated a lead that might have to do with some white supremacist groups. And it's not clear to me who exactly is a Vinlander and who isn't. So I don't necessarily want to say like, oh, everybody was a Vinlander, or if some people flirted with it but didn't join. either way, it's very distasteful and certainly not good. But it's hard to know that like all of them even knew each other, let alone we're all part of a similar group.
I will say though, I probably know 90% of the heathens in Arkansas. It's very common for you to know, like, the non-racist ones. It's very common because I know a lot of the racist ones too, but it's very common. We're such a small community. It's very common for us to know each other. Because, you may have to drive. I mean, it's very common for us to drive 30 minutes or an hour to meet with a group because there may only be one within 30 minutes or an hour. So, not all of us live in a big city and can throw a rock and hit six heathen groups like Ben. So, I want to talk about these particular things that are heathen related, that were pictures that some of the Frank's Memorandum stuff was based off of. So this is from, we're just going to call this the main guy. This is the main guy that a lot of this is focused on. And he was pegged as the leader, it seems. It seemed like a lot of the events, the heathen stuff, happened at his house. And this here, he was talking about hitting a Gabo rune, which is an X. And it's just basically talking about like the stuff that was happening, and he was having a rough day, but the gods are giving me a gift, Gabo, and then Isa. Let's try to slow this down with Isa. So Isa is ice, right? So those runes make total sense. He's trying to slow down. He feels the gods are giving him too much. So he's trying to slow down what the gods or what the universe is giving him, right? That's a pretty common, what we call a bind rune. They, for some reason, have decided to include Hagalas in here, which means hail as in hi, how are you? Not hail as in the stone. I don't even see Hagalas in there. I mean, he explains clearly that this is Isa and Gabo. Like, he even says what he's doing. And like nothing here, once again, if I saw this on my feed on Facebook, I'd be like, oh man, I hope so-and-so's okay. Like nothing here is alarming or concerning.
Yeah. And I should also say that runes, I'm a rune. I'm one of the, I do not mess around. I have a couple rune tattoos, obviously, but like, because one must. But I tend to be a rune skeptic, and I look at these kinds of things and say, well, sometimes it just means what the person says it means, right? Like they put the symbols on themselves, and sometimes a lot of us chuckle at like, oh, I see a Kenaz there, and I see an Awaz there, and I see a this there, and some people don't. They just don't know.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
They'll tell you. They'll tell you. Like most of the time in the communities that I have experience with, they just tell you what it means, and you just kind of have to go, all right, like okay.
But I will say, it's very much like, this is very much, to me, this is just a pretty basic, like nothing here from a heathen, from an inclusive heathen, an anti-racist heathen, nothing here grabs my attention as like, this is problematic.
Right. He's just he's one line short of an asterisk.
And I just want to shout out, to give credit where it's due. We didn't make this. A wonderful, wonderful researcher named Thomas did. And this guy,
thank you, Thomas.
He was so good. He did this. He did all this work, and he was just like so generous to share it with us. And I'm like, he like, because that's the best part. We've talked about maybe some of the drawbacks of internet sleuthing, but when you do have people who are just kind of going out there looking for the truth, have an open mind, and who are able to pull the social media things and really compare them one-on-one and say, is this how it's being described? That was so valuable to hear.
Yeah, and it's important to know this guy, Thomas, he did not go into this with an agenda. He did not want to prove that the Franks motion was wrong or prove that it was right. He just wanted to see what's in there that I can back up.
And I'll say this, because I think we're going to get more into this, but the thesis that I think he came out of this with was like, without a lot of what was stated about the social media was really overstated, perhaps, in the Franks Memorandum, and connections were drawn that seemed kind of weak when you really scrutinize it, and that's concerning, and it gives the impression that the document, while it may have some very good points, and we've talked about some of that, like why is he in prison, and like maybe the police should always be highly scrutinized, like you have to look in and make sure they're not lying, like that's all very good, but were things included in this to really more of incite public opinion around a new theory, and is that an appropriate use of this whole thing? And I think this really speaks to that, and we'll get in. I hope you guys want to talk about some arrowheads, because I
we've got arrowheads in here too.
Yeah.
So the next one, of course, is basically the Hagalaz rune, and what he's doing here, it looks like it's basically just rune studies. Like, I don't know if this was like a rune draw he did, or if this is just him studying. This layout, for those of you who are non-heathens, is a pretty common way for people to like record if they do like a similar to like a tarot spread for people who might be familiar. People who do draw like a daily rune. This is not once again, if I saw this on someone's Instagram or Facebook, I'd be like, oh, look, that's his rune draw for today. We have a whole, like in the Troth, we have a Discord, and literally most of us post our daily rune draws every day. In fact, I'm working on a project where I'm drawing a rune every day and then doing a different color stripe on a blanket, so that by the end of the year, I'll have a blanket that each colors by the different random rune I draw each day. And it's more along the list just to have a really cool, like different shade of blue blanket, but by random. But once again, I don't see anything here that is concerning, other than some of his definitions are a little leasty, but that's an inside. It's more of a heathen thing. Like, I don't necessarily like some of his definitions, but like nothing here is. I would argue, if he was my friend, I'd argue with him about his definitions.
Hold up. I'm gonna pause that for a second. Leasty. What? So when Lauren says leasty, it means, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lauren, it means reminiscent of the rune theories of Guido von Least, the late 19th century, early 20th century crank who developed his own theory about runes, runology, mixed it with Arianosophy, and sold it to the Volkish movement, basically. However, he was a very early source that people used a lot. Certain people who may have also founded the Troth, who people used a lot as a reference for their early theories, because there just wasn't a lot out there at the time. Now that we have a lot more research, obviously things are a lot better. But when we see language like that looks leasty, it looks like what we mean is it seems reminiscent of those early kind of crackpot theories about the runes.
And to give you an idea, Guido von Leest came up with his entire idea of the runes because he was bedbound for 2 years due to cataract surgery and couldn't see. But to quote my podcast, we don't talk about Guido. No.
There you go. Disney angle.
It just happened. Other podcast I do with my best friend, and so he and I break out into song randomly. It's just kind of our thing.
Short digression. Just wanted to be sure that all listeners knew when we say leasty, it just means that it's reminiscent of crackpot theories from the late 19th century.
Yeah. So here is the painting I referred to on your podcast as Heathen's first painting. I've seen a million different versions of this painting. Okay, not a million, but I've seen a lot of versions of this. This is Odin hanging on the tree, self-sacrifice. It is missing the will. But beyond that, I mean, yes, it has some hidden runes in it, but Odin also hung on the tree for the knowledge of the runes. So having runes in this painting is absolutely on theme. And this is so common. We're quoted in this. It's so cute. Oh my gosh. According to the experts on the Murder Sheet podcast, it's a very, very common image in these religions.
This is becoming too meta. It's all feedback.
This is meta. But I wanted to share this picture specifically because I used to have a similar picture hanging in my house when I was a baby heathen. like
Aw.
20 years ago. I mean, a lot of people have, this is the heathen equivalent of white Jesus or crucifix. I mean, it's just,
And it's
it's
not like
real
bloody
common.
or anything. Like one thing that struck
No.
me was like, it's a guy hanging upside down. From the detail, I can't really tell that he took out an eye. It's not. I mean, it's like unusual if you're seeing it, but I think one thing Thomas made a point about that I agree with is it's not inherently gruesome. It's just unusual if you don't have that heathen background. You might be like, "What is this?" But I don't see it, and I'm like, "Oh my goodness," you know.
Precisely, Anya. Unusual would be the way that I think most people would look at this and say, well, I think they might look at it, and if they're coming at it from, let's say, a very Christian background, they'd look at this and say, well, this doesn't look right. This is not what I'm used to seeing. You know, first off, the guy's hanging upside down, not right side up, as we know. You know, guys are supposed to hang. That's how it's the complete reverse of that. So I can understand if someone is, you know, saturated in Christian iconography, looking at this and saying, this ain't right.
Or you
Like
might think
something-
like
some-
it's like if you don't know if it's a religious thing, you might even
Yeah.
just think like, what's going on here? Like what
Yeah.
wacky situation happened? It's a it really it doesn't strike me as ominous or threatening inherently.
No.
And I also
Honestly,
think the
yeah.
myth is like that he did it to himself to help people and learn about runes. So it's not like people were doing this to him.
Yeah. And I
Also,
think,
for
I'm sorry.
me, if I looked at it, it kind of looks like a dude who got caught in his own like bear trap.
That's
Like
what
his
I
own like
said.
yeah.
No.
It looks like someone tried to paint some bad incident from Naked and Afraid.
Yeah.
It does.
What kind of weird survivalist religion is this? You know, but actually, no. This is one of our holy stories. It's just a story about a time that Brad got caught in his own bear trap.
It was a bad week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bad week for Brad. We decided to immortalize
Something
it.
went wrong.
Yeah. So I said, it's like, once again, nothing in these pictures inherently alarms me as a heathen. So then now we're getting to sticks. And like I have said, I don't know if it was your show I said this or if it was I was on with Trisha on Web Sleuths, but I'm like, this is literally an example of what I was talking about though. I'm because right here it says he's at a preserve and labyrinth. I don't know anything about Hervey Preserve, but if I went to a walk outside in my backyard, I could find runes like this. Yep. It sticks on the ground in a shape. It's not exactly an uncommon thing if you go in the woods and you'll find sticks that have fallen in angular shapes.
Right. And one thing we had not a debate really, but a back and forth with Thomas was about like, you know, did he fashion them himself, or it almost seems like he's finding these, you know, as opposed to like making them. I don't know. It's not clear, and there's not like a description of what he's doing, but it's interesting. And like as you said, when you have sticks in any situation, if they're relatively straight, they may fall in angles that remind us of things.
Yeah,
well, like,
and I've noticed some of the sleuthing that's been done on this is like people. I've seen some posts where people are saying like, I know the meanings of these runes that are there, and this pieces together my theory of like what he's trying to say with the runes. And again, me being the rune skeptic, I even if I were to grant that these were not just merely the way the things fell, and they were just kind of placed that way, I don't know how we can decipher anything of someone's mind from those runes, because to me it's like, I don't know, they might just have thought those runes looked cool, and they just decided to put them like that. It's not like some kind of super secret message that if you decode it, he'll tell you who he is. You know, it's a lot of seeing stuff that just we may never know. And that's, again, like you were talking about before, it's disturbing when you just don't know. right? It's disturbing when things just don't make sense. So your brain reaches out for any kind of meaning, no matter how macabre it could possibly be.
So we're going to get more into runes. So here is a thing where he's cutting runes. So he's got a saw and he's literally just cutting a stick up into rounds to make runes. Okay, so let me give some background here. There is a belief among a certain set of people who practice runes, and runes aren't inherently just heathen. You will find a lot of Wiccans, a lot of non-heathen pagans who also use runes. So essentially he's cutting up. There is a belief by a lot of groups that to make runes, they need to be made of wood. They need to be of a fruit-bearing tree. There's a whole lot of I don't buy into, but sure, some people believe this, and that I'm going to let them believe. They're, whatever works for people. And so what they're doing here is literally they're just cutting up a stick into rounds so that they can then carve symbols on them and use them for divination. One thing this does do apparently is tie two of the people involved together, because this is a picture of one of the other people on the leader dude's page, that he posted, but that's all they're doing. And here talking about, he's cutting discs to make runes. What again? I mean, this is what he's doing right here. That's what he's making. Nothing here. Once again, nothing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that kind of is connected, but also is somewhat different, is that allegedly at the crime scene there was one branch that looked like it had been sawed or cut rather than broken. But what's interesting is that sounds like, oh wait, that's interesting, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense from the perspective of, like, obviously he's doing that at his house and it's for a specific purpose to get these little rounds off. And like, wouldn't it make more sense if you took a stick away from the crime scene to do that? Like, it's hard to say, like, where does that fit into this?
Can I point something obvious here?
Mm-hmm.
That's a corded saw.
Yeah.
How are they going to take that to the woods?
That's also a very good point.
So more runes. And then, oh goodness. So then they've got this whole thing with like brass knuckles and knives that they're all into. I don't really care. More guns and okay. So now we're going to get into the arrowheads, where they're all about the arrowheads and finding arrowheads, and everyone has arrowheads. And then mason jars.
So with these, I want to point, this is where the idea that maybe not all these men are Ásatru comes into real play.
Yeah.
So one of the men, not the leader, but he may know a mutual friend or mutual acquaintance with the leader guy, but there's no real evidence that they know each other directly, just maybe that they have a friend in common or an acquaintance in common. And so, one thing that these images are supposed to do in the citations in the Frank's Memorandum is tie the leader man with this other man who's from a different part of Indiana and, again, doesn't have a direct connection to him. What they're saying is that this other guy from a more southern part of Indiana is copying leader man's Facebook by posting similar images. So, like, if I wanted to do an homage to Kevin and show that we're connected, if he posts a picture like of a selfie of himself in front of, holding up a book, maybe I do the same thing. And so that's what they're arguing here. And what Thomas points out is that when you really look at the images, a lot of them seem A, pretty generic, and B, pretty similar. And here's an example. You go to one of the arrowhead photos of a palm holding an arrowhead. I have identical pictures to that on my own Facebook from an archaeological dig I volunteered for in North Carolina a number of years ago. I have that where it looks very similar. And so when you're taking something so generic and trying to say that this must mean these men know each other, and again, this other guy, this non-leader guy, there's nothing that we found on his social media that indicates that he is any sort of practicing heathen of any type. And so it seems odd that he's being flung into this whole, like, to have a cult, but then have one guy who maybe doesn't even do it is just, it's just, I don't know. It's possible he's secretly practicing, we don't know what's in his heart, but it just is interesting from that perspective, because it seems like more like a way to tie them together than anything to do with Odinism, heathenry, or anything else.
It does see, and I do think that looking through this stuff, I'm going to be honest, when I first read the Frank's Memorandum, I walked away with a sense that I really felt they didn't do their due diligence. I felt if they had spent 30 minutes on the phone with me or with really any heathen leader, they could have contacted anyone, an owner of a pagan shop in Indianapolis. They might have had a better memorandum and a better, more concise defense than what they did. I feel like, I hearken it back to the Satanic Panic, and I have these conversations. But the fact of the matter is, this does feel like if you take out Odin and put in Satan, it's very reminiscent of, it's that whole idea the cult did it, the satanic, it's very much about, this can't possibly be this guy you see all the time at CVS where you pick up your antibiotics and cough medicine. It has to be these outsiders who practice this weird religion that you don't know about. And we're going to stretch this as much as we can. I saw some of the crime scene pictures from the Frank's Memorandum. I saw the rune that was allegedly, and I saw this pictures that basically the outline pictures of the girls' bodies that Court TV had. First of all, runes don't come in cursive. And that Fehu they were trying to put out there it looked like a cursive, like high font F. It did not look like a rune. And second, they were trying to say like the body position had something to do with like tarot and all this other stuff. And I'm like, well, you guys are conflating a whole bunch of different stuff into one. Like, I really do feel like it genuinely felt like a satanic panic. And even to the point that I found out when, the fact that for the most part, this is an invention of the lawyers. This even an invention of Richard Allen bothers me a lot that, the lawyers came up with this idea. This is all the lawyers, well, Richard Allen didn't tell us this. We just guessed, right? This was just our thoughts. We don't have any evidence. This is just our thoughts. And it's not a lot of evidence and a whole lot of, these people practice a weird religion, so they must have done it.
And how powerful are these like othering narratives that are created? Like, I don't know, in your guys' experience and other things you've looked at, other stories you've covered, like othering narratives can be really powerful. And Lauren, when you brought up that tarot was somehow thrown in there, it almost feels like just like, yeah, they're other. They do weird stuff. What are you gonna, yeah, tarot's in there too. They do tarot. But
and I will say, as a heathen, I've had bad experiences in Indiana.
But how powerful?
Yeah, we had Christmas
narratives?
there, and it was bad.
Right. And to me, I think that's such a great question too, Ben, with the othering narratives, and also throwing in the fact that children were murdered and that it's children endangered. That's often with othering narratives something that can be very powerful. And if people don't understand something, that might trigger something in your brain to be suspicious or angry towards a group if you feel like they're threatening children. And I think something you said, Lauren, really resonates with me. I think to me, like, it's like anybody from any religion can do any bad thing. It's not, to me, it's like, if someone's like, oh, the Catholic serial killer, okay, sure, yeah. I think where it gets problematic, and where I think there could be a real benefit to narrowing and being specific with language about Odinism versus Ásatru versus like, what's the motive here? Is it really a sacrifice, or is there, when we reached out to one of the original investigators on this, they indicated that they did not feel it was a sacrifice. They felt like the same people were involved, but they had a different sort of motive and some different facets to their theory. So there's like more than one theory out there about this, and it sounded like the original one was a bit more grounded in like people who know each other and more personal motivations. So I think that's important to remember. and I think it's just important for attorneys, whether they're a prosecutor or a defense attorney. I think both can fall into this. To when they're kind of dealing with a group that may be a minority or may not be as understood by the wider public, to just maybe take that care in crafting something that maybe is drawing upon, like, okay, maybe there are religious aspects to this crime scene, but maybe not conflating behaviors. Is almost, I think some of the tone of the documents on this and other documents almost read like, of course who else would do this? Of course we don't, of course they do sacrifices. I mean, what did you think? What do you think the Vikings were doing? I mean, it kind of gets into territory.
I wanted to ask Kevin, do when lawyers write this kind of stuff, when they sit down to write these kinds of briefs, do they write with the idea that this will get out, this is really going to light a fire under the public's butt, like if it gets out, or is it much more like, I'm just trying to get the judge to see it my way? Like, I just want the judge to see it my way. Or do they think like, what if this were to get out? Like, maybe that's going to help me. Like, I'm not going to do armchair quarterbacking here, but like, in your experience, like, do you know lawyers who practice this particular way, like actually thinking about public opinion and how it might be swayed by a brief they might write?
I think a lot of attorneys do look at public opinion, and they try to mold public opinion the way that they think is most likely to help their side. And so that might include just picking language or phrases that might attract more attention, or playing up certain angles of an argument that's more likely to get attention, because lawyers are often media savvy and they know what gets the clicks, they know what gets the attention. And so, I think
there's not necessarily a harm in that, especially, I mean, in fairness, the prosecution had 5 years to kind of set a narrative, and there was a gag order that came down immediately in this case. So to me, using filings as a bit of a press release may be somewhat understandable. I just think that if that's going to happen, it just needs to be very, very careful that you're not then maligning a whole group of people, especially a group of people that may not be understood everywhere. People may not know. I think this is kind of the first a lot of people have heard that, there is a community of pagans and heathens in the United States, and they may not have been super aware. And so for the introduction to that to be so wholly negative, I think is unfortunate, because I think it conflates a lot of things, and we've talked with experts on the show and talked with you all. It's not that there's not violent white supremacist gangs that are affiliated with Odinism in some way, but that's very much a separate thing, and the violence there tends to be political and just kind of like not sacrificing white children in the forest. So it just it kind of gets into a kind of complicated place, I guess.
I do want to ask you also from a kind of, I'm going to ask you to armchair quarterback this one. Do you think, Kevin, given what we know about what was released,
in the hot seat,
there might have been strategy with filing it in the middle of the night, knowing that so many people are stalking this case like it's Britney Spears in 2008?
Yeah, I think these attorneys are very media savvy. The judge, as Áine has mentioned, has locked down some of their avenues for reaching the public and getting what they want out there. So, I think it's entirely possible that was done deliberately. What do you think, Áine?
I think the fact that the judge sealed it pretty quickly thereafter, the horse was out of the barn. I mean, there was almost no point in doing so, although I understood, there's a lot of graphic details about the deaths of 2 children in there. And also it named suspects, right? I mean, it named suspects. It compared one man to Charles Manson. I mean, it was very heated rhetoric. And so I tend to think that was probably a strategy. And again, like, I don't even necessarily have a problem with the idea of using any medium to try to zealously advocate for your client. I think that our system needs people who are, going for it. But I just think that when such broad language is used about a religion, and again, I just feel, I can't help but feel that, like, anytime like a a symbol of heathenry is mentioned, there's like ominous music playing in the background, and like the narrator looks at the camera like woo, and I think that is very othering, and I think that is unnecessary. I think you can have a theory like this and do it in a way where you don't need to do any of that. Maybe you get a little bit less punchy in the language, but you end up with something that might do less harm to innocent people, while still zealously advocating for a client and looking strongly at people you think may be involved.
And the thing is, like the Vinlander part, because we do know some of those guys were actually in a gang, like it's right there. Or Odinism as a gang system is right there. Like, what gets me is like it would not have been that hard to construct, using a lot of this, an actual viable argument if they had taken 30 minutes to talk to someone who actually is in this faith. And that disappoints me, but doesn't surprise me. And it's hard. It is really hard. I do have a lot of concerns, and I want to thank you guys for the very sensitive coverage that you guys have given, and the advocacy that you have given for heathens who aren't flaming racist gang members, that our voices are heard, because this has been very hard. And, I know my first negative experience I had as a heathen was, I've been heathen for like 2 years or less. And one of my coworkers' brothers was a prison guard. And I was immediately called into HR and accused of being a racist for wearing my hammer. And it hurt. Also, because my husband at the time I was married to was biracial, so it was real confusing. And it hurt a lot. But then, I realized if his only exposure to this faith is in prisons, it makes total sense. And I, as a heathen, I understand that, but at the same time, it is very, we don't have the PR machine of most groups. And it's very hard. We fight stuff. We don't have the budget, though.
Yeah.
You're right.
Get me the church, the budget of like the Catholic Church or the LDS Church, and then we'll talk. We don't have that multi-million-dollar budget to run ads. Yeah, to run ads or that kind of thing. And I do question: are we was it just because we're an easy target, right?
Right.
We're just an easy target.
People were asking us, like, is Delphi known for Odinism? Like, there's this sense that everybody is an Odinist up there, or everyone's a heathen or whatever. And it's kind of like fascinating because, like, I mean, we've talked to people up there and we're like, just in case we're missing something, is there a lot of heathenry in the area? And the answer has been pretty much no. One guy very colorfully said, we're known for, what was it, like agriculture and meth. And I was like, okay. Like, I mean, I don't think it's that negative. I think he was being somewhat sarcastic, but I mean, he was like, it's not known up there. And I think it's really unfortunate because it isn't known. And then when you're putting this in there, then people are just maybe coming away from it with something very, very negative, and that affects real people. And we just appreciate you coming on our show to kind of set the record straight. We really would encourage people. It's okay to sleuth. It's okay to be curious and look into things. But we would encourage people, like Thomas did an amazing job with that. He came into it with such a open mind, looked at the facts and analyzed them without necessarily assuming that the defense is bad or all heathens are bad or all heathen symbology is bad. He just keeps keeping an open mind, looking at the facts, pairing them together, and drawing conclusions from that. And I think with heathens, the work that you all do with such an inclusive and lovely faith, I think is just really inspiring, and even helping people in a prison setting avoiding the white supremacy, horrible side of it, is great. And you should be commended and supported for that, not lumped in with, the Odinists, and certainly not made out to be, constant child murderers who, could kill again at any moment. That's not fair to you. And I hope that now that we're in a new era of the case, that maybe if some of the sides are working together and kind of coming back to it, maybe that there is a more narrow tailoring of this theory, of the language used, and perhaps there can be just less of this broad brush being used that ends up splattering, people who don't deserve it, like inclusive heathens, and I just don't think that's necessarily the best.
It's not how I want. It's not how I want to be introduced at my next PTO meeting. Definitely not.
Yeah, it's I will admit I was making some headway locally in some stuff, and Delphi set me back significantly. Not because the person I'm working with locally in the government thought I was a bad person, but they were concerned about what that was going to reflect on them. If they Google this and they see heathen, how is that going to reflect on this in a very red area? It's already hard enough to put your reputation on the line to allow pagan to do something. Add to that, and you end up with some pretty hard issues. But it's hard, and I sincerely hope that people continue to, to me, what broke me of any kind of sleuthing was Reddit after the Boston bombing.
Oh my God.
When they identified the completely wrong people responsible for the bombing, and an innocent person's life was completely ruined. And that broke me from those, not just that, but even I even avoid those communities because for obvious reasons,
Yeah.
Of course.
It when people get into this mentality that it's okay to post whatever because we're all just speculating, I think people forget that there's real people, whether that's a specific person or a faith or a cultural group, or it just it dehumanizes, and it flattens, and it makes real conversations impossible. And I think those real conversations are ultimately more helpful, and that's why we're so grateful for the work both of you are doing, coming on our show, chatting about it. And we just, we wish you all the best, and we just hope all the heathens out there who are listening to this who are inclusive and chill, hope you're doing okay. And I think a lot of people do feel like, one thing I will say in the spaces we're in, at least, I think people are looking at some of it with skepticism, but also I think some people are looking at it with okay, we understand that maybe we can dig into something here, but that doesn't mean that all heathens are bad and we should suspect.
Yeah.
I hope that some people can at least take that open-minded.
I think that the hardest part, though, has definitely been the broad painting of everyone as an Odinist, whether they are a heathen or they're Ásatru or they're Odinism, because there are big differences. The broad painting that everyone's an Odinist has been the hardest thing, I think, for me to overcome. So I'm hoping if you're watching this and you're not a heathen, but you're a fan of the Murder Sheet, if you can take that away, is that these are the differences between a Catholic, a Protestant, and a Jehovah's Witness, right? They all share some very different, very similar, core things, as far as they all worship the same God, essentially. They may share some ritual structure similarities, but beyond that, the beliefs are very different. The values can be very different. How they're structured is very different. And I hope, if nothing else, you can take that away, is that it is very different. And Ásatru is not a part of Odinism. Odinism is its own separate thing from Ásatru and heathenry and all the other, because, that doesn't even touch on the tons of other kinds of heathenry that we don't even get to talk about, because, you talk about the Aglawa or Anglo-Saxon or all these other ones. There's so many, but, we're
open up my jacket. All this heathenry falls out. What the? You guys want some heathenry?
He's our heathenry. We were at Parliament of World Religions. He was our heathenry dealer.
You're in the back alley, just, hey guys, want some?
We got some Aglawa looking really good.
Hey guys, I heard you're looking for some Anglo-Saxon. You want some Franks? I got some Franks. It's just, it is. And that's the thing. There's a lot of settle on that. And once again, reiterating, there's been exactly one murder associated with Odinism. Who was it, Ben?
Was it me?
This, Ben. No.
No.
It was in the 90s. Varg.
Oh, Varg Vikernes. Yes, Varg Vikernes. Yeah. Killing the
murdered his bandmate
Øystein Arseth of Mayhem. Yes. Okay.
And then they played a concert the next day. It was wild. Yeah, and now he's in France and out of prison already. It's
No,
but yeah.
what are you gonna do?
So yeah, so essentially, yeah, and that's it. The idea of ritual sacrifice doesn't. I've never seen that ever in my 20 years. Like, it's wild. So what's next? What on the road with this? They've gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "Fine, you can have your lawyers back." What's next?
They're back. We were gonna wait. I mean, there's gonna be opinions that are handed down. The order came out immediately, 4 hours. It was really quick.
Yeah.
So that's a win for the defense, but it's also not necessarily such a blow for Judge Gull because she wasn't kicked off the case. So it's kind of just a weird, like, everybody get along thing right now. Either that or the defense will try to ask her to recuse and file for her to recuse, basically, maybe get her kicked off. She might have like a hearing where she tries to kick them off again. It's kind of unclear. We kind of feel like that might be clarified when the opinions come out, because like basically one argument was like, you can't throw us off at all for anything like this. It's not just that you threw us off in the wrong way. So we don't really know what the judges or justices rather agreed with, but kind of a wait and see. Even though the status quo is restored, we'll still be covering it and just kind of doing all the different angles of it, including the Odinism theory and the theory outlined in the Franks Memorandum. But we're kind of just like, we don't expect anything in Delphi because whatever happens, it'll just be just some bizarre, awful thing, probably.
Next week, they're going to suddenly file an addendum to the Franks Memorandum that it was the Scientologists all along.
Honestly, at this point, nothing would shock me. Literally anything. Like, just this whole awful situation with the leak was just horrifying, and just the fact that then they're kicked off, they're back on. It's been such whiplash for a lot of people who are actually in the middle of it. Obviously the families and people sort of associated, and it's sad and unfortunate. It is a case that I think just kind of wrecks things as it kind of comes into contact with them. And that's why I'm, again, so sorry that your religion got dragged into it, because it really is. It's a pretty destructive force, this case. It really kind of, people and things that come into contact with it. It's kind of wrecking ball.
Yeah, in my experience speaking with pagans in Indiana who have called our organization, it has been very traumatizing for a lot of even non-heathen pagans who feel endangered. It's even the ones who live in like Indianapolis. A guy contacted me who owns a pagan store in Indianapolis, and he felt very endangered. Like, he felt like he was worried he was going to start getting threats because he had a rune class scheduled coming up. Like, he was very worried. And I do question that, and I do worry. I mean, the Troth, we actually used to have one of our annual gathering every 3 years in Indiana until somebody blew a horn, like a animal horn, to call people to dinner, and some camper across the way thought we were sacrificing a goat, and a bunch of cops showed up. It was a thing. So yeah, Indiana's not my favorite place for heathen stuff.
Hey now, Lauren, now we gotta fight. Gotta use your representation. I think a lot of people in Indiana can be open-minded. I'm so sorry you had that experience there.
Well, it was in like, to be fair, we were almost in Ohio. We were.
Oh, okay. Well, then it's their fault, obviously.
And I lived in Ohio. I can say that.
Can't blame the Hoosiers for that.
No, I mean, but it was a pretty, but that's the thing. It's like, I live in Arkansas. That kind of stuff happens here.
Right.
But I do think that it is a little scary. And I really thank you guys for at least some advocates. And like I said, it's a scary time. And I do hope, at the end of the day, I think the thing, stepping outside the heathenry thing, I'm upset that I feel like justice may not be served. All of the circus, and we're losing sight of the fact that 2 young girls, that were middle school age girls, were brutally, brutally murdered in ways that most of us don't even want to fathom. And we're left in the woods in horrible ways that we're not going to discuss, but just think of the most horrible ways that a child could be killed, and you're in the ballpark. And I think that, to me, is, I do feel like a lot of people are so far down the Odinist rabbit hole, or this rabbit hole, or that rabbit hole, that we're losing sight of the fact that families of these two girls are being repeatedly traumatized, and they may never see justice. So I will say that for us as an organization, we have prayed to our gods. We have a God of justice, and we have prayed not for us, but for Libby and Abby and their families, that they will receive justice. Because that, at the end of the day, if Richard Allen didn't do it, I don't want him to go to prison. What I do want is justice for these two little girls and their families, because that's what is actually important here. And I feel like everything else that's getting dragged in is, it's a circus to distract us from the real issue that is the crime that happened.
I think that's really well said, and I'm sure that they appreciate that. It's absolutely been, I think, traumatization and re-traumatization over again for anybody who loved these girls and the community that they came from. I think sometimes people forget that those things are real and exist and are important, and it's not just all about online stuff. And so thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for having us.
So if people want to find you, where can they find you?
We're on all the podcast platforms. We post a number of episodes every week, and to Spotify, Apple, Google, whatever you listen on, just look up The Murder Sheet. It's SHEEI. It's SHEET. I can't spell apparently, but just look us up, and if you subscribe, you'll just get a bunch of episodes each week. We do Delphi. We do a lot of episodes on Delphi. We very granular coverage of Delphi. We also do other cases,
author interviews,
Mm-hmm.
with law enforcement, interviews with defense attorneys, various types of attorneys, many attorneys. And I would say we do something where we get a little more relaxed in an episode where we kind of, at the end of the week, where we just talk about like crime headlines and different updates and cases, and I act more unhinged, and Kevin reels me back, and it's fun.
Hopefully something.
I really enjoyed your episodes you put out recently. Or not recently, but the episodes on Delphi where you went into both the prosecution and the defense's theory of the case, and kind of broke them down about where you think they were going right and going wrong. I think that's a really great, if you're interested in the case and want to kind of get like a real good overview, I think those are really great places to start as far as understanding the actual legal case and the Frank's memorandum and everything going on. I think those episodes were really great. I really enjoyed them.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Kevin saved the day with that one, because I couldn't think of a title for it with bad facts.
Yes, it was. And then also occasionally you can catch them on Court TV, sometimes with me, sometimes in the segment before me. It's really funny when they called me, they're like, "Can you be on Court TV?" I'm like texting you going, "I'm going to be on Court TV tonight."
They were fun. They're great. They do some really good crime coverage, but they were texting us. They're like, "We need an Odinist." I'm like, we don't know one. We don't know an Odinist, but we know a very nice heathen. So hopefully everybody's learning.
I was really excited. They had me for 2 segments this time. It was exciting. And I really enjoyed the gentleman they had on with. I've been emailing him and trying to get on with him. He's great. And he was the one that was like agreeing with me. Like, yeah, I don't think this was a cult murder. I've dealt with cults. This ain't a cult murder. Because this guy legitimately solved a cult murder from like a fundamentalist Mormon cult murder. He would know. But yeah. And so go check them out. They are wonderful. And Murder Sheet. You can also go back to September and listen to Joe and I on the Murder Sheet, where we go in depth about prison stuff. And some of it is incorrect, because none of us thought they would be wearing, anything personal on their uniforms. I think we were all wrong about that.
Right. Yeah, that was, I know that surprised a lot of people. I think it was interesting to us because it was like, it seems like it would be kind of a weird thing to do in the workplace, but it's also,
Well, it broke Indiana's actual rules for the uniform.
Yeah. So
Joe had looked that up, so we knew.
Right. And so it's like, okay, that's definitely concerning. It's not nothing. It's just interesting.
It was weird.
But we so appreciate you coming on.
Yeah.
check out all those episodes, and we'll continue to chat and hopefully have some of these conversations, and hopefully maybe we can have conversations about the case and the theory without othering an entire community.
Exactly.
Doesn't deserve it.
Exactly. Well, thank you guys so much. Ben, you have any final thoughts?
No, I don't. I learned a whole bunch tonight. Thank you guys both so much, Kevin, Áine, and everyone. Go listen to that podcast. Subscribe to that podcast. I actually have as well, so I'm getting the goodies every week.
You should.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We leave you now with our new professional outro. Have a good one.